Welcome back, guys. Today's lecture is for Wednesday, April 15th. Um, we're going to finish the lecture today. Notes are going to be finished. I will upload the study guide onto Classroom tomorrow. So you'll have the essential question. So this week we'll only have 2 essential questions, and then you will have the rest of today, Wednesday. So you have the rest of Wednesday and Thursday to do it. And then Friday will be when I will assign the quote unquote take home test, and you'll have the weekend to do it. So we're going to start off with the Southern Manifesto. We're going to go back a few years. So we pretty well stayed on a specific timeline from start to finish this chapter. But now I'm going to get into I'm going to go back a little bit to 1956. And the Southern Manifesto was, I don't know if you'd call it a declaration or a decree, but it was a document that was written by many Southern, or it was written mostly by Strom Thurmond, a Democratic senator from South Carolina. But it was supported by much of, really almost all Southern congressmen. In it's about their displeasure with the Supreme Court. This is following Brown versus Board. So this is in response to the government deciding to integrate schools. So in it, they talk about how they believe the Supreme Court grossly overstepped its boundaries. Like they thought the Supreme Court was abusing their power. These Southern leaders did not believe that the Supreme Court had the right to desegregate the South. So, and their response would be to push back on any kind of legislation that the federal government planned on passing. This is really just a statement saying, we think you were wrong in what you did, and so we are going to fight every chance we get. That's all this was. It doesn't actually provide any change, but it fuels some of the counter protests by Southern whites. So African Americans are protesting for their rights, and then some Southern whites are counter protesting that. It's a real big mess. There's a few dissenters. Now, I probably should have worded this differently. There's about, when you break up the map into like southern states versus, if you think about the Confederate States of America, think back to Civil War when this South versus North really starts. There's a deep South, and then there's border states. And some border states join the Confederates and some stayed with the Union. Border states such as Kentucky, Delaware, later on West Virginia, states like that, Oklahoma. And there were plenty of congressmen from those states that didn't sign the Southern Manifesto. But as far as deep South congressmen, these 3 men were the only 3 senators. Now, there's a few representatives that didn't sign it, but senators are a little more powerful. These 3 Southern senators did not. From the state of Tennessee, there's Al Gore Sr. and Estes Kefauver. And Senate Majority Leader from Texas, Lyndon Baines Johnson, future President Lyndon Johnson. They refused to sign the Southern Manifesto. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily they were extremely passionate about civil rights, but they didn't feel it necessary or effective to sign this. Now, Al Gore Sr. later on has a son, also named Al Gore, who runs for president in 2000. He's defeated by George W. Bush. But if that name looks familiar to you, that's probably why. Estes Kefauver, this is about the most famous thing he does. As I previously mentioned, Lyndon Johnson becomes president. So they go out on a limb by not signing this. They're kind of scorned by their own party and even by their own people that voted them into office. Like Gore and Kefauver especially face a lot of opposition from their people. They're shamed for not joining the rest of the South. But this was just a document that was kind of a warning to the federal government of, hey, we're going to fight this. We're not just going to lay down and let desegregation and integration happen. And for most of them, they certainly did. They certainly lived up to that. So now we get to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So fast forwarding back to our normal timeline progression, now we're at a time where Lyndon Johnson is now president. He actually just got reelected in 1965. He fills in for JFK after his assassination, and then Johnson runs for re-election or for election, and he wins in a landslide. Actually, he has a ton of support. A lot of it's from, Kennedy supporters and wanting to believing that Johnson was the best option to carry on Kennedy's plans. And he was. Johnson becomes very involved in civil rights litigation, and he was instrumental in the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was a piece of legislation that further enacted voter protection. So it furthermore gives federal government power to oversee all elections. So there's a federal officer at every voting booth that is there to make sure there's no voter intimidation, there's no handing out of literacy tests or charging a poll tax or any of that stuff. There is now a federal officer there to supervise. It also provides bilingual ballots for citizens that were in territories with a large amount of immigrants, or not necessarily immigrants, but people of a different language, because you have to be a citizen to vote in the U.S. But that was actually a really big deal, because that was not something that was previously fostered, that idea. So this Voting Rights Act has been amended a handful of times since. It gradually gets more and more protective over voters' rights. Basically, nothing can be used against you to keep you from voting except your age and your record. Record is in like your criminal record. I think, what is it, if you have a felony, or if you've been found guilty of a felony, something like that, uh, or a certain grade felony, you can't vote. But yeah, they were. This is probably the most extensive piece of voter legislation that had passed. Because again, none of these ideas are brand new. Maybe the bilingual ballot part is kind of new to this bill, but uh, the biggest effect was that the federal government laid out a plan on how to enforce these rules. That's the most important thing. You can lay out all these rules and how they're going to shape society, but if you have no plan on how to enforce them, then they're pointless. If I have a list of class rules and then I don't hold people accountable to it, then that list of class rules is pointless and it has no meaning. That's what so many other pieces of voting rights and civil rights bills were lacking, was enforcement. And this Voting Rights Act 1965 definitely laid out a plan of enforcement. So no more literacy tests. Now the only thing they could discriminate on was age, which I mean discriminate. The only that's probably not even the right terminology, discriminating on age. The point be, like, it's a rule, you can't vote until you're 18, and that's the only discrimination, the only qualifier. Doesn't matter what your skin color is, what language you speak. If you're a citizen and you are at least 18, you can vote. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1968. So we go from a Voting Rights Act to an overall Civil Rights Act. This was just a continuation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we talked about last week. And in 64, it made illegal to keep someone from living in a certain area because of their race. Okay, it made it illegal. Now, what the Civil Rights Act of 1968 does is it creates a way to enforce that. Again, these ideas are great, but you have to have a way to enforce and make people follow those rules. Well, the Civil Rights Act 1968 placed people in charge and set forth, rules and enforcement of them. So, equal housing opportunities for all races. It was now a federal crime to threaten someone to leave your neighborhood because of their race or ethnicity. That was a legit federal crime. If you had a case, or if you felt like you were being ostracized or threatened and forced to leave your neighborhood because you were the only minority living there, you could call a federal agent and they would prosecute. They would move towards an investigation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 said that that was breaking the law, but there was no federal enforcement. You would go to your local police and say, hey, they're burning a cross on my yard telling me if I don't leave, they're going to kill me and my family. And that local police is probably going to say something along the lines of, oh, well, if you didn't see specifically who it was, then we can't do anything. Well, now the federal government gets involved, and they're always going to be more powerful and more stern. Now, within this bill, or within this act, was also a couple sections that pertain to Native Americans. It actually provided protection for Native American citizens. It gave Native American citizenship, something they had. Native Americans that were living on reservations now became American citizens. And they were protected under the equal housing opportunities. their land was protected by the federal government as a, hey, sorry for all those years of torture and taking all your stuff. So at least we did that, I guess. Um, but yeah, so this Civil Rights Act covers a lot of. This wasn't just a bill to help African Americans, although it does help African Americans, but it helps really all minorities, all ethnicities. And the Civil Rights Act 1968 is seen as probably the most effective piece of civil rights litigation in history. The most effective. And it, again, it 100% boils down to the fact that they put a plan in place on enforcement. That's the most important thing in any government bill or act, is to have a plan to make people follow those rules. Well, that's kind of a problem with modern politics today. We have all these bills and acts that are passed, and there's no plans in place on how to push them or how to enforce them. That's why a lot of it gets wasted. And then the few bills that do have enforcement plans, they get met with a bunch of opposition because we're so split down party lines right now. If a Republican drafts a bill, then the Democrats have zero interest in passing it, and same vice versa. If a Democrat writes a bill, then the Republicans have zero interest in passing it. So anyways, that's a whole different topic and issue. So now to our central question, why was the Southern Manifesto written? What did they say? Like, what was the point of it? Why did they bother sending it? Like, it was like 100 pages. This was not just a little letter of, hey, we don't like what you did. Why was it written? It says it on my first slide today. So that's the end of the lecture. That is the end of the chapter. Obviously, civil rights doesn't end in 1968. That last act, the Civil Rights Act 1968, I forgot to mention, it was written in response to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and the riots that followed. There were a lot of riots by African Americans in the South afterwards because it sent them into a panic. Their leader had been killed. And the last part of this, I forgot to mention this, the last part of the Civil Rights Act 1968 actually made any kind of travel, the way it was worded was travel by interstate commerce in order to start a riot or cause corruption, or not insurrection, which essentially made peaceful protest difficult because peaceful protest requires interstate travel by groups of people to cause insurrection. So that was one negative to the Civil Rights Act 1968, was it blended peaceful protests with rioting. So anyways, yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that part. It's the end of the chapter, and let's see, today's Wednesday. So tomorrow we will have a Zoom meeting. I want everybody there. It'll be quick again, but it will be mandatory. I want you guys there. We're going to talk about how we're going to do this test, and I'll walk us through it, and if you have any questions, you can ask. But I just want to get that taken care of. I want everybody tuned in, and I really just want to hear from everybody. Make sure we're all still on the same page. We're kind of in that middle phase. You know, we got, what, I think like a month left of school, so I just want to get some things ironed out, make sure we're all on the same page, and make sure everybody's doing all right. So, all right, guys. Well, I appreciate you tuning in. I will talk to y'all on Thursday.